For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Books Corner. I am Ashwin Ahmed and I'm pleased to be in conversation with journalist and author Ashley Rindsberg. Today we're going to be talking about his book, The Grey Lady Winked, an expose of just how the New York Times conducts its journalism. Ashley, first off, a very warm welcome to you on the show.
Thank you very much, Ashwin.
First off, when and why did you decide to do an expose of the New York Times in particular?
I was always a New York Times reader, even from sort of a younger age. I think many people in the U.S. are, especially you going to university, and it's kind of the newspaper you get exposed to, and it's treated as really this gospel, this deliverer of truth from the heavens. And at some point, I was almost inadvertently tipped off that this might not be the case when I was reading a book of World War II history by William Shirer, who himself was a journalist. And he casually mentions in a footnote that on the eve of World War II, September 1st, 1939, the New York Times ran a story that claimed Poland had in fact attacked Germany, and Hitler was just retaliating or defending his borders, which is actually how Hitler justified his entrance into Poland at the time. And I wanted to understand if this was true. Did the New York Times actually run a story that was claiming on that crucial date that Poland had attacked Germany, which ran counter to everything we know and assume about World War II and its outbreak? And I went into the archive of the New York Times and I saw that story, and sure enough, that is in fact what the story claimed. The only source in that story, which was the lead story of that day, meaning it was the far rightmost story, was a Nazi newspaper. It wasn't referred to as such. It was referred to as a semi-official German outlet, but that in fact was a Nazi newspaper. And that was the only sourcing for this incredibly important event. And that sort of triggered this whole wave of research that I would undertake for the next few years, and really going deeper and deeper and expanding into numerous historical episodes like that one.
We were talking a little bit about, other Western media outlets, like the BBC, the Washington Post, etc. Now, how do you believe that they follow the same journalistic principles as the NYT? How are they different?
In the book, I actually show, and this was something that was very important for me to track, is how other newspapers were covering the same events that the New York Times had misreported on or actually distorted intentionally. And that was the case that I saw time and again. For example, when the New York Times was celebrating the Nazi Olympics of 1936 as the greatest sporting event of all time, other news outlets, including CBS, Murrow's Boys, the Washington Post, were really lamenting it as a complete disaster, as a devastating crisis, because it gave the Nazis this propaganda platform that they sought, and everybody kind of knew that. But the New York Times was hailing this as the greatest sporting event of all time. And that's a pattern that we saw again and again and again. Another episode in my book, The Grey Lady Winked, I show that the New York Times made a backroom deal with the United States Department of War to print United States government propaganda concerning the atomic bomb. When it dropped the atomic bomb, the United States government didn't want the world to know that there was such a thing as radiation poisoning, because that would not really look quite good, that you drop the bomb and all these civilians, and not just the people who died directly from the blast, but all the people within a certain radius were going to be just killed from poisoning. And that was something that would have really sent the American people into a state of alarm, to think that we have this devastating new technology that kills you without even really being able to see what it is that's killing you. The New York Times made a deal with the Department of War to cover this up. In exchange, the New York Times got access to the bomb project, which unprecedented exclusive access to the Manhattan Project, and a seat for its journalist on the bombing run that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki, the second bomb. And when you look again at how other newspapers or journalists covered the question of radiation poisoning, which was a huge question at this time, we saw other journalists reporting that there was such a thing as radiation poisoning, that Japanese doctors were reporting that patients with no visible injuries were dropping dead left and right. And, again, we see that there were different ways of reporting. And this does reflect, I think, a big difference at the New York Times from the rest of the pack, which the New York Times is different from the rest of the pack. It is number one. It has won more Pulitzer Prizes than any other news outlet in America, double its next biggest competitor. It has a reach and an influence that is truly unparalleled in the American news media industry. And this is something that correlates to the way it approaches reporting the news.
I want to come now to the individual journalists of the NYT. And again, I want to come back to Germany. When you talk about these individual journalists, do you think it was a bias? Do you think it was ignorance? Or do you think it was maybe ego that, I know the story so well that, I don't need to look deeper?
I think it's a case-by-case basis in terms of the individual journalists. In the case of what was going on in Berlin, their bureau in Berlin in the lead up to and during World War II was a case of Nazi collaboration. Their Berlin bureau chief was a man named Guido Enderes. He was a man known to the Nazis and known, by the way, to the New York Times to be a Nazi sympathizer, they called him, but I call him a collaborator because he actually acted on his sympathies in a way that was very impactful. Later, in the case of the infamous Walter Duranty, who would cover up the Ukraine genocide, Ukraine famine, which was a genocide perpetrated by Stalin against Ukrainian peasants that resulted in the death of between 5 and 7 million of them. That was not a case of Duranty being slovenly, as the New York Times has tried to cast him for the last 100 years or 90 years or so. It's rather a case of malfeasance that started at the very top of the newspaper. The New York Times instructed him to cover up that crime. And he sort of went along with it. He was sort of going along to get along. And that was very good for his career. The New York Times made a celebrity out of him. So I think it's a case-by-case thing. In the case of Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the creator of the 1619 Project, which came out in 2019, I think that's a case of someone who is a ideological firebrand. I think she believes absolutely in what she's saying. I don't think it hurts her that it's made her a celebrity as well. I think that sort of is a little bit of a cherry on the top. But I think case by case, it's different for every journalist. But I think the through line for the New York Times, which is really what connects all these different episodes, is that the New York Times consistently puts its own primarily financial and secondarily ideological interests ahead of its mission of gathering the news and presenting the facts to the world. I think that is the real distinction here.
Yeah, yes, I mean, you made the point again and again that these superstar journalists continue to, kind of distort or maybe in cases obscure the facts. The Ukrainian famine is a key example. Do you think the problem is even more problematic today? Are we seeing even more superstar journalists?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the most pernicious trends we're seeing in the American media, where it's not just that celebrity journalists exist, it's that you have this whole phalanx of journalists and journalism that is trying to achieve celebrity status because it really suits them. It really helps them with their careers, obviously with their lifestyles. And I think that's a very dangerous trend, because what ends up happening is that whatever this celebrity journalist prints or publishes is taken as truth, as gospel truth. And criticism is almost not allowed. It's something we see with the case of Nicole Hannah-Jones, with the winning a Pulitzer Prize, winning a National Magazine Award, winning a Peabody Award, being featured with major other celebrities in conversation, having a deal with Oprah Winfrey. These are things that create this sort of aura of almost undeniable truth that can't really, this infallible status that it casts upon them. And that's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing with journalists. We should be respectfully questioning. We should be respectfully maintaining a posture of skepticism, healthy skepticism, but never what we're doing with Nicole Hannah-Jones and what the New York Times has done with other celebrity journalists, which is hold them up as these magical spewers of sacred truths.
Do you think Though, I mean, what if I were to say to you, I mean, how much does it matter today? I mean, you have the age of social media, you have the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, you have, the far more media than there was then. Is it
Yeah.
as problematic now, or is it not so much of an issue?
The dynamic has changed significantly because, as you're pointing out, on the one hand, the media is now more diverse. We also have independent media today. We have global media like your program, on the one hand. So proportionally, the New York Times' power is probably less than it was 50 years ago, where it really could just set the entire news agenda for all of broadcast television and radio, etc. But the flip side of that is that we live in the news today. We don't have one moment of our lives that is not being quote unquote mediated. We are constantly involved with news and social media, on our phones, in conversation. It has just completely swallowed us. So in that regard, I think it has actually deepened the impact. So when we have a false media narrative, let's say about Russia and Trump colluding, which we're now seeing this week is really just completely unraveled. It is something that gets into almost our bodies, almost our physicality, because we are inundated with it. So I think that is where the dynamic is changing and is shifting. We have more options, we have more viewpoints, but we also are digesting more deeply whatever is coming out of the mainstream media, because it is an onslaught, it's a barrage.
How do you see the New York Times coverage of, countries like India? I mean, there's been great unhappiness with, the bias of the New York Times regarding, what we see as one-sided stories about India and, especially about our prime minister. How do you view that coverage?
When you look at the so-called evidence, when you just look at the reporting, look at the headlines, look at the kind of the subjective choices, what kind of adjectives, what kind of modifiers are used to describe India, it's plain to see. I mean, you can list out the headlines that are just one after the other about racism in India, xenophobia, backward practices, rape, a really disastrous response to the pandemic on virtually every node, including things that really don't exist. And I think sexual assault was the big one that leapt out of me, because I had seen this in the New York Times. I came across this phrase where a New York Times reporter used the term a rampant culture of sexual abuse. And that is a huge claim to be making that you would really need to be supporting very, very carefully in order to say something like that, especially in today's world. This was just kind of tucked into the reporting as a premise, as if it's obvious to everybody. And I actually went, probably like 99.9% of readers do not do, I went to the statistics, and I discovered to my shock that India's statistics on sexual crimes are a fraction of what they are in the US and in most of Western Europe. And this boggled my mind to see how to just juxtapose these two ideas, that the New York Times is claiming there is a rampant culture of sexual assault in India, and then the reality is that there is far less instances of sexual assault in the country than in most other places on the planet. So this is something that really rings an alarm bell to say something here is off. There's a narrative that's being created, and it's one that's parallel, I think, to an instance of one of the chapters in The Gray Lady Winked, which is about how the New York Times characterized American service veterans of the wars of Iran and Iraq, where they came back and they said these veterans were returning to America as homicidal maniacs. They were committing murder at a disproportionate rate to the rest of the population. And I went and I looked at the statistics provided by the Department of Defense, the statistics the New York Times itself was relying on, and it shows that, in fact, these veterans were committing crimes at a lower rate than the general population. You say, this is something that really requires about 1, maybe 2 minutes of research to disprove. It's the same thing with India's so-called problem of sexual assault, or, we could take a number of other examples, such as its management of the pandemic. When you look at the coverage side by side with the New York Times' coverage of China, And China, it's almost breathlessly praising China's response, this crazy authoritarian response where you have the Chinese government locking people in their homes. And we actually don't really know what the effectiveness of the Chinese response is because there's no real data. And what the New York Times does is takes CCP official data, which is 100% skewed and probably falsified outright, and presents that as fact. And it goes to India, which is a democracy where there are mechanisms to present authentic data, takes that data and says, look at these two places. One is a complete failure and one is a success. And we know that's a lie. I don't think anyone, it's a stretch of imagination for anyone to say this is completely false. But then again, we have to say why. And I think that's the important question.
Ashley, now, can any nation do anything about this? Because, I mean, for us, it seems that, a Western journalist, by and large, has come into India, and he or she is the South Asia correspondent, mostly. I mean, he's flying in, flying out. He's already often made up his mind. Is there anything that, India could do to perhaps counteract such negative reporting?
I think it's really something that individuals need to do and communities need to do to take upon themselves to elevate the kind of reporting that is more accurate. I think it is a good thing for government to empower independent media by giving them access to government sources to say, okay, let's give the New York Times and the Washington Post an interview with a minister, but let's give it another opportunity to independent media to do exactly the same, because that's what really produces a diversity of viewpoints, a diversity of opinions. And I think over time, what we'll see is that people will gravitate toward the truth. I think that's something we all can recognize, is that we know when something smells fishy, we know where a lie is lurking. And when we see that there's an opportunity to say, okay, there's another outlet out there, which is not trying to radicalize us or polarize us or push us in some political direction, but is really doing its best to show what it believes to be true, to bring us the facts, I think people will go in that direction. So I think it's, number one, upon individual news consumers to say, I'm not going to stand for it. And I'm not going to sit at home and shout at my screen that this is wrong. I'm going to do something. And I think that's simply about elevating the news sources, the stories, the reporters, doing your homework and taking responsibility for your role as a news consumer. Because in truth, today, we're not just consumers of news, we're producers of news too, as individuals. Every time we tweet or go on Instagram or do a podcast, we are helping to either support or tear down a narrative that's true or that's false. And I think that's something we should embrace fully.
From your book, I got the takeaway that the NYT over the years has a set of core values. I mean, they made up their minds on certain things, and quite often the journalists don't question that. Do you think those core values have remained despite social media and that they will not change?
I think the New York Times does have a set of core values. I do think, though, that those are secondary values. Primary values are the values of self-interest. We have to keep in mind the New York Times is controlled fully by a single family. This is a dynasty. This is a 120-year-old American political media dynasty. And like any dynasty, they're out for themselves. They're out to maintain their wealth, their power, and their status. And I think that's primarily what dictates choices and decision-making at the New York Times. But I do think that alongside that, there is a set of ideological values that we see in the New York Times that is, for example, very anti-nationalist, that is sort of supporting this socialist-minded worldview, this very universalistic paradigm of how the world should look and how the world should be. And the New York Times really hates it, really, really gets annoyed when they have examples of nations or countries or people or places that disrupt that worldview. For example, their worldview saying that you can't have nationalism coexisting with pluralism in a country or in any place. And we do see that in India, which is a great example of a place where there is a strong national identity coexisting with a pluralistic society, as well as in Israel. That is something that really gets under their skin. And we see it in their reporting. And I think that does in part explain why their reporting is anti-India, because there is, I don't think, a financial impetus there. So then we go to the secondary values and say, The New York Times has an agenda here. In this case, it's ideological. The same thing with Israel. They've had an anti-Israel bias since the founding of the country. They were anti-Zionist from before the country was founded. And we consistently see that in the reporting. In Israel's case, there was a recent piece by the New York Times' Jerusalem correspondent that really he went touring around the country for 2 weeks, trying to find every bad thing that he could find around the country, all the upset people, and he stuck it all into one news report. And you say, how is this news? And how does this reflect the reality of in a country where 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 people consider themselves to be happy? This is one of the on the happiness scale, this is one of the happiest countries in the world. And the same when you look at India. And I think that's where we see that kind of ideological agenda at work.
Ashley, we could go on and on about this, but yes, we have to keep in mind that the New York Times perhaps will not change, and that the customer today needs to be a little bit more empowered and not take these Western news organizations as gospel. Please, as Ashley said, support your independent media organizations. And thank you, Ashley, so much for sharing your insight. I do recommend to everyone, please buy and read The Grey Lady Winked, because it's something to think about. Thank you again, and thank you everyone for watching. I'm Ashwin Ahmed. Goodbye.